Welcome to the session Method or Constructors, Parameters versus Arguments in Methods and Constructors, or in Method or Constructors. So we've already seen code that has where the method or the constructor has its parameters, like this: string new string, string new username, string new password. We saw this in our class database code. And there's also the class main, where you are going to invoke those methods. And in that case, you would call, create the object, then invoke the method via the object. And in that case, you'll pass arguments to the invoked methods. So I just wanted to clear this out. Conventionally in Java, when you're passing variables at the method declaration or at the constructor declaration, we use the word parameter, or we call them parameters. When you're passing arguments to the invocation, we use the word arguments. So just to set that apart, more often when the word argument is used, is in reference to an invocation. When the word parameters is used, it's in reference to the variables that were passed in the declaration. So just take note of that. However, it depends with the kind of official documentation you're using. Sometimes the terms arguments and parameters are used interchangeably. So at some point, you might just need to look at the context to understand which is which. Another thing about the arguments, they must match the parameter type and order. For example, if one is of type string, then one is expected to be of type string here, and so on and so forth. And it should be in that order. I'll be demonstrating that in a bit. I'll try and go in and change the order or the data type, and then you should expect compile time errors. Now, so parameters can be of any data type, but later we will see how we can also work with passing a method into a method declaration. So we'll talk of lambda expression, and we'll talk of method reference later on to see how we can pass a method inside another method. So let me just go to the demonstration to walk you through this. We're talking about parameters. We'll stick to the parameter of this parameter here, the method connect. So it's 3 strings, string 1, string 2, string 3, and 1 integer. If I was to invoke that parameter in my main method, to invoke that method in my main method, come into my main method, create the object for database. Let me just call it Oracle once again, then new database to initialize it. So through Oracle, I will be invoking connects. When I do that, I'm expected to pass the arguments in the order of the parameters. So it's string, 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 integer. If I was to start by integer, I should expect to see an error because it's marking that integer as new connection string. That is a string. So let's see how this goes. Let's say username admin. The next parameter, we're calling it, let's say password blah blah blah. Then finally, it expects an integer. So if I type 6, then it is marked as int y. So immediately you see that there's an error here, and the error should state out to me that we are expecting a string. Okay, it's showing me that it's expecting a string. I'm either required to go and change it to int or to pass a string here. So they should be of the same data type and the same order. So if I was to change the order, then the wrong thing would be passed in. For example, connection string, if I want to work with the URL, and instead I pass in the username, and I pass this in as URL, when I'm using that argument in my code, there will be errors, logical errors in my code. So take note of that. It should be of the same data type and the same order. When you're passing arguments, it should reflect the same data type and same order of your parameters. Let me just fix this back to URL admin, and I'm making this test Y. So I called it Y here. It was just for testing purposes. So never mind that. It's just so we can understand that discussion. Okay, moving on. Now, on methods and versus constructors, parameters and arguments. When you talk about arguments, we'll be working with, I'll walk us through arbitrary number of arguments, but I'll use the main method to explain this. So conventionally, we work with string array, and the name we use for that parameter is args. That is conventionally. I had also mentioned in the previous session that argv is also conventionally accepted. However, what is allowed is you can name this anything you want. So that's why I said anything. It will not cause any errors if you use anything that you want. Like for example, anything. That should not cause any errors. It is still accepted and it will run. So going back, what is also accepted as of JDK 5 is varags. So varags are variable, they stand for variable arguments. So we work with dot instead of working with a square brackets to represent an array. We work with dot. So you can use this as a shorthand for any method. Though I'm using the main method to demonstrate, but you can use it with any method. When you want to, when you're not sure of the number of arguments that you would be passed in your method, you can just work with dot as a shorthand for an array. It accepts random arguments, including none. And what happens is the Java compiler will automatically convert that to an array. So it will still be treated, the arguments that will be passed in as variable as they are, they will still be treated as an array. So when you proceed on in your Java journey, you will expect to see this in methods like printf. This is an excerpt, or rather a signature of print, although I included the modifier too, of printf method in the official documentation. So it's taking in string format and arbitrary objects by the name args. So when you use the printf in your print statement, it allows for passing in of the string format and arbitrary number of arguments. We use this when we want to format our arguments. We'll see more about this when we proceed with our journey. I thought it would be a very nice example to bring it here, because the very first Hello World we created, we saw how printf was the output that was automatically included. So I wanted to make sense of that here. However, takeaways at this point, if you feel like this is too complicated, is args is what we use, conventionally. Argv is also conventionally accepted, but you can name it anything. It's just a parameter for your main method, and then you can decide to work with the shorthand for variable arguments. Not only in the main method though, again, it's acceptable in any method where you might not know ahead of time the number of arguments that are expected. And what will happen is then the Java will treat it as an array. So I have already demonstrated that before and a while ago. Next, parameter scope, the name of the parameter and the scope. The scope of the parameter name is within the method. So if it is used in a declaration of a method, the scope of that parameter will be within the same method. For in that case, or in that note, the parameter name needs to be unique for every scope. This is what I mean. For example, if this is my method right here, let me go back to class database. If this is my method here, and I am, not that one, this one, and I am using the parameter new connection string, I cannot create another parameter by that same name within the method. If I try to use, mistyped. If I try to use the same name within that scope, it will not allow me. It needs to be unique. It needs to be unique. I can either reuse or I can use a new name. It needs to be unique within that scope. However, you can use the same name with the same name that has already been used with a field. So this is an example field. If I decide to create another string in here and give it the name connection string, then that can work, and it will be referring to the scope of the method. So this is the field, but this is the scope will stick to the parameter, the method itself. You should practice with this, and I'll make a point of noting that out in the description on your practice exercises. So when that happens, if you decide to use the same name of your parameter with the field, because they're in different scopes, so that can apply, or the same name for the parameter or the same name for a variable, a local variable in your method, that is called shadowing. So parameter with the same name as the class field is a shadow. You mostly see this. So let me just remove this. The field bit, we shall handle that later. Let's stick to the parameter here. So you'll mostly see this in setters, which makes sense to try and so we can know ahead of time what are we trying to set. So we have this from a previous session. We saw how we created the setter and the getter for this private field. So we have this field here by the name password, and its setter has a parameter by the same name. So that right there is called shadowing. They have the same name as the variable, the field. Now, it's doable, but it can make your code unreadable because it might be difficult for somebody who's just getting introduced to your code to know which password is which variable is referring to which password, what password is this variable referring to, or rather what value is this password, what variable is this value pointing to? Is it pointing to the field or is it to the parameter within the scope of the method? So just take note of that. Now, conventionally, I will use them in setters, like I've shown you. But the shadowed parameters get to refer to the parameters and not the field. So just take note of that. They're referring to the parameter and not the field. When you use them within the scope of the method, they are referring to the parameter and not the field. The field value does not change. You'll see an example of this in the next slide. This in the scope example of this in the next slide. So to refer to the field, if you specifically want to refer to the field in your class, then you work with the this keyword. We'll talk more about the this keyword later, but you can see it here. This keyword. So we are saying this password, and that will reference this variable, the field here. Okay, so if you say this password, you're referring to the field. Otherwise, if you just use the word password, it will be referring to the parameter and the parameter alone, and it will stick to that scope. Even if I was to, like I did earlier, to create a new variable by that same name, it will be referring to, okay, though I can't do this. I can't do this because there's already a parameter by the same name. If there was a different, if I didn't have a different parameter by that name, then it was possible. So let me just say, because the scope is the same, you cannot have the same word or the same name within the same scope. So I'll refer to this. Now I can do that like this. So it has the same name as the field, but it could be confusing. Just take note of that. It's possible, but it's confusing. I'll just undo this. Okay. Now to the scope. When you are passing primitive data type arguments to your method, so I'll use another example with this. When you're passing a primitive data type arguments to your method, there is a way in which the compiler, or rather how it's handled in the background. So let's work with this example here. Okay, so we have this method here, primitive data type. It has one parameter of type int by the name passIn. In our main method, we have this object for that blueprint by the name testInt, and within using testInt, we want to access this method primitive data type. When we do that, we'll be passing an argument. So we are passing the argument passInMain, and that argument is already a variable that we've created within our main method. So how this is handled is, so we can understand scope, it is like if you had a printer. You took the value of passMain and you printed a copy of it. So that is how it's handled. So that copy, the copy of that value, will be stored in passIn. And what is passIn? PassIn is the parameter. So let me just stick to the code to explain that again. What happens in the background is you have passInMain value, and a copy of that value will be taken and stored as the value of passIn. So in this case, passIn and passInMain are treated as two separate variables, which they are. So within this scope, we're starting by printing passIn. So what I expect when I run the main method is to see that 6 argument, or let me just say 6 is the argument. Next, we're taking that value that was in passIn and resetting it to 10. So what I expect to see in this sout is passIn, which is 10, was set in method, or rather reassigned in method. Now, after that is done, the invocation bit is we are through with that. Then we go back to the main method, and this statement, print statement, then we expect it to print 6 assigned in main, because passInMain is treated as a variable that is completely separate from passIn. You should have named this passIn method. I'll do that in the code that I'll share. Set in main. So if I run this, I expect to see 6 is the argument, because the value 6 was assigned to passIn parameter. So 6 is the argument, this line here. Then, in fact, let me just start from the top. We say that main method is the entry point to our code. So from the top, within our main method, line 1, we've created, the first line in the main method, we've created an object by the name testIn, or for the blueprint arguments, which is the same class. Then we have created a variable by the name passInMain, and we've set the value of that variable to 6. Then we are invoking through our object the primitive data type method. So this, and we are passing in passInMain. So this should take us into that method. We've passed in here the value 6 as passIn. Inside that, we are printing passIn. So which is why we are seeing here 6 is the argument. And then after that, the next line, we are reassigning passIn value. So after that, we print, and which is why we are seeing 10 reassigned in method next. After that, we go back to the main method, because we have reached the end of our method scope. So we go back to the main method, or rather how it is handled in the background, it goes back to the main method, and then it prints passInMain, set in main, and hence 6 set in mean. So this will retain the value of 6. Within the method scope, it is discarded once the method returns. So the changes will not be reflected outside of the method. And that is what I tried to illustrate here. So int pass main is like the original paper with its value, and then the printer duplicates it. So we have a copy here of that value. That value is stored in this method's parameter, which is 6. We can reassign it, which we did in the method, but it will be destroyed outside of the scope, such that if you come back here to print, the value of pass main is retained. Later on, we'll look at how the same thing is handled, passing arguments for reference data types. So stay tuned. Up next should be objects and object creation, and that is the point where I'll also include passing reference data type arguments. See you on the next one.